This video will touch on neurons and glial cells, and this is important because everything our bodies do, we do it in communication with our nervous system. This nervous system is made up of cells. The most important of these, historically, according to neuroscientists, have been nerve cells or neurons. The other type is known as glial cells. These cells underlie the simplest to the most complex abilities we possess as humans. Neurons chiefly process information, so they receive input from many other neurons, they integrate that input, and distribute it along to other neurons. Building from the historical context you learned about in week 1, the discovery of neurons and its structure led to the neuron doctrine. Basically, what that says is that A, the brain is composed of separate neurons that are independent both structurally and functionally, and B, information is transmitted from cell to cell across small gaps, and these gaps are called synapses. Now, keep in mind that while we're going to look at diagrams of individual neurons, there are about 86 billion neurons in the brain, a roughly equal number of glial cells too, and that each one can make 10 to 15 synapses or 1,000 synapses across the brain. Neurons, like other types of cells, have cell bodies. Here is a terrible diagram that I made of one. They contain organelles just like other cells. Some of the main ones I want to talk about are mitochondria, ribosomes, and the cell nucleus. Mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell. They produce energy the cell needs. The cell nucleus contains genetic info or instructions for that neuron, and ribosomes help to translate those genetic instructions into useful proteins. Neurons, unlike many other cells, are unique in that they collect signals from several sources, they integrate that info, and they distribute it to many other cells by means of its own electrochemical signals. All neurons have some distinctive structures that we see in this diagram. On the left, we have dendrites, which are extensions off of the cell body. These serve as input zones which receive information from other neurons. These are elaborately branched to accommodate all of its neighboring neurons. Then we have the main cell body, which you saw in my terrible drawing in the slide before. The cell body acts as an integration zone. It sums up all of the signals from other neurons and then decides on whether it should or should not fire. The pinnacle of this integration occurs right before the axon, and in this diagram, it's right before or right where it says axon. This is referred to as the axon hillock. The axon here is the long yellow part. It is a single tubular extension that leads away from the cell body. This is the conduction zone, which transmits info in the form of an electrical impulse. Axons are myelinated or are wrapped in myelin sheath. This helps to insulate and speed up this electrical impulse, which is known as an action potential. Then at the end, on the far right, we have the axon terminal. This transmits the electrical information into a chemical message that it releases into the synapse for other neurons to receive. One more note about action potentials, the electrical signals that travel down the axon. It's not one constant signal the whole way down. They are regenerated along the length of the axon. Action potentials are spikes of depolarizing electrical activity. This strongly depolarizes the next adjacent axon segment. The depolarization creates a new action potential, and it does this on and on all the way down. This regeneration happens at the nodes of Ranvier, which are the gaps in between the wraps of myelin sheath. This process of the action potential jumping from segment to segment is known as saltatory conduction. There are a few typical or common types of neurons, but interestingly, there are hundreds of different types of neurons that have been discovered over time. The three main ones are shown here. The example from the previous slide is an example of a multipolar neuron where there are many dendrites and a single axon. This is the most common type of neuron. Another type is a bipolar neuron. Here there is a single dendrite at one end and a single axon at the other end. This is more common in sensory systems like with our visual system. Then there are unipolar neurons, which are also called monopolar neurons. They usually have a single extension, which can be thought of as an axon that branches into two directions after leaving the cell body. One of these ends is the input zone and the other is the output zone. These cells often transmit touch information from the body into the spinal cord. Just another quick distinction between different functional types of neurons, we have motor, sensory, and interneurons. For our purposes, motor neurons govern movement with long axons that synapse onto muscles. Sensory neurons carry sensory messages from the periphery back to the spinal cord. And the majority of neurons, including the majority that make up the brain, are interneurons. These are neurons that receive info from other neurons and pass it along to other neurons. When an electrical signal is transmitted from the axon to the axon terminal, it is translated into a chemical message. These chemicals are then released for the other neuron to pick up. There are some names for this part that you should be aware of. The presynaptic neuron is the neuron that is sending the signal. So here it's the yellow one. The presynaptic axon terminal contains a bunch of tiny spheres, and these are called synaptic vesicles. These carry the chemicals that we call neurotransmitters. When the signal comes in, these vesicles fuse with the presynaptic membrane and dump out all of their neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft, which is also called the synaptic gap. These neurotransmitters then interact with the postsynaptic membrane, which is the one in green. This synaptic gap is really small, about 20 to 40 nanometers, but it's just enough to transfer these chemical signals. I should also say that these synaptic connections are not fixed. The configuration of different synapses on a neuron's dendrites is constantly changing. They come, they go, and dendrites change their shape in response to new patterns of activity. We call this changing neural plasticity. The number of dendritic spines, which are the final outgrowths on top of the dendrites, are pretty quickly altered by different experiences. So whenever you read a news article about something changing the brain, this is kind of what they're referring to. Okay, a couple things about glial cells. These are the other types of cells besides neurons. They have historically been ignored and understudied in the field. They were originally believed to hold the nervous system together like nerve glue, but glial cells also communicate with each other and with neurons, and it can actually directly alter neural functioning. There are a couple of main types, microglial cells or microglial cells, some people call them. They're also referred to as janitor cells, and they're really helpful with disposing waste. They come into contact with a site of damage, and they kind of form a spherical containment zone around the injury, kind of like police tape around a crime scene. They migrate to these sites, and they help remove debris from injured or dead cells. Microglial cells are also important for forming new synapses, and when this process is blocked or has interference, it's been associated with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementias. There are two different types of cells that help with myelination. Oligodendrocytes help create myelin sheath within the central nervous system, so within the brain and the spinal cord. Oligodendrocytes are multitaskers, so one of these cells can simultaneously service many other neurons. Schwann cells do the same thing, but they are outside of the CNS, so they service the peripheral nervous system or the rest of the body. Schwann cells are not multitaskers, so one Schwann cell can only myelinate one other cell at a given time. A note on myelination in the brain, we've probably all heard of a disorder called multiple sclerosis, or MS for short. This is a demyelinating disease in which this process of myelination is broken down. So there's a breakdown and loss of this insulating myelin sheath. And you can look up details about MS on your own time, but eventually the outlook on patients with MS is not very good. So these glial cells, in this regard, play a very vital role in the brain. The last type of glial cell is an astrocyte. These are star-shaped cells, and they help to regulate blood flow, and they provide critical supplies to neurons. But astrocytes have recently been in the spotlight for their role in information processing. They can communicate with other astrocytes, and they have been shown to actually modulate neural activity. So They're actually much more than the nerve glue than what people have said in the past.